More and more in our policy debates, marriage and family are discussed as important drivers of economic and social outcomes for kids. But could having more intact families affect other things like voter engagement?
In the family, people are receiving really the touchstone of civic engagement, learning how to address these problems and to govern themselves.
On this episode, we talk with an author and researcher who argues that the family is an essential institution of civil society, and he explains why having more healthy, intact families would actually help improve the civic health of the United States. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and on this week's episode, we're talking about marriage, but in a little bit different of a context, talking about the civic and social impact of the institution of marriage and family. Joining us for this conversation is, returning to the show, our Chief Growth Officer, Derek Monson.
Hi.
Thanks for being with us, Derek. And our special guest this week is Brandon Dabling, who's the author of A New Birth of Marriage, a book that essentially argues for the social, political, and individual importance of marriage and family in today's society. He's also been a professor of political science at Brigham Young University and is an independent researcher who focuses on the American Constitution and the politics of love and family. So, Brandon, thanks for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you, Nick. Happy to be here.
So we want to talk about, the reason I frame it as it's a slightly different lens, much of the discussion recently around marriage and family, which is gaining steam in policy conversations, which is great and very important, but it's through kind of an economic lens mostly, or the lens of the upward mobility and development of young kids. But you talk about in your book and some of your research about sort of a different, broader lens of, well, what about marriage and family as a civic institution? What impact does it have on sort of our civic world and the country? So I want to start out first, Brandon, by asking you, because of this heightened attention of marriage and family, how would you describe, as we shift into this lens of kind of the civic impact, how would you describe how marriage and family impacts our civic outcomes? Voting, elections, other kind of civic institutions. Give kind of the just general philosophical argument for why it's actually really important to think of in these terms.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so, and that's a wonderful question. So, unfortunately, I should give a little bit of a warning before I launch into this. So, I'm a political philosopher by training, and so it's very rare that I get asked a question without asking another one in return. So, when I think about the civic outcomes of marriage, the first thing that I think about is, well, what is it that as a society, as a Republican, free society, that we want as our civic outcomes? That's the first question. And when I think about that, the very first thing that I think about is, well, I want a people that is free, capable of bearing those freedoms responsibly, and bearing the burdens that are inevitably placed upon them as self-governing citizens. So when I think of these outcomes that we want, I go back to thinking about, well, what is the meaning of civil society or civics? And the Latin for the root for civics is civitas, which really means the body of people that compose the state. So that's you, that's me, that's everyone that we come across and that we live together. We're trying to build a community together. And we want that community to be about something. And, in America, we want it to be about promoting freedom, enduring freedom, responsibility, and the protection of basic natural rights. And so the question that governs all of my political thought is, well, what kind of things can we do that promote that? And the answer that I've come to through years of research is that the family is at the heart of that. It is a key institution that promotes all of those things. One of the things that, I'm sure we'll have a chance to get into a little bit later is that the family is where people really have kind of a test lab of solving problems and governing themselves. And it's in those family units that they're learning how to govern. And so I would say that right there starts to answer that question. So you have to think about the core civic outcomes that you want in general, and then we can talk about how the family provides that.
Derek, what's your take on this shifting of the lens, or maybe rather a broadening of the lens that we've been arguing, and you leading our policy team and our efforts here at Sutherland to help make the case that, look, the family as an institution is really important for economic outcomes, for, we've talked about child outcomes and development and everything, but are we at a loss if that's our only frame of reference? Is this civic sort of broadening lens, is that compelling to you?
It is. I mean, the economic value and the benefit and role of the family is critical from the economic standpoint. But there are lots of other standpoints that matter, and that's actually a thing that's in our politics we can easily kind of fall into, is that all that matters is money, and frankly in the world of politics, it can seem that that's all that matters. Campaign donations, everything. You want to do things that raise money, and that means you have to appeal to people who have money. Oftentimes that means people in the economy, businesses, and that kind of a thing. But from a standpoint of a good society, a standpoint of the kinds of neighborhoods and the kinds of communities we want to be in, a lot more matters. And so the civic role of families becomes critical in that standpoint. What is the unit of the family, the institution of the family doing? So, at Sutherland, we've looked at that economic aspect in our recent report, Utah Family Miracle, and that's an important thing. And we should continue to look at those elements because, the family is also often neglected in the economy. We oftentimes think of the economy as being a bunch of businesses and a bunch of individuals. It turns out all those individuals, whether they're in the business side or the consumer side, are part of families, really. For the most part, certainly. And so that's really what's driving economic activity. But that's also true in other areas of society. When you are participating in a political process, up at a legislative hearing or voting or attending a city council meeting, the considerations going on include your family. And that's oftentimes, again, something we just don't highlight maybe as much as we should because it's the fundamental way that people think. And in as much as we're going to make government, public policy based on those realities of how people are living and the realities they're living in, you have to account for family, and that includes the civic role.
Brandon, I want to, Derek, because you mentioned civics, Brandon, I want to ask you that there's a quote from Governor Spencer Cox's one of his State of the State addresses, where he talks about how we know in the data that it is cheaper and easier and more effective to solve problems in society, essentially, if you're starting in the family. And in that context, I think when we think about anything, we think, well, we want people to be civically engaged. We want them to vote. We want them to serve and volunteer in their communities and be involved in these other community institutions, or we want them to have good educational or economic outcomes. The tendency is to go to what sort of government or social programs can we create around this, instead of saying, well, what happens in the family that can support that? So maybe specifically with the civic piece, and especially Derek, with your experience and research you've done on elections and kind of voting policy, start with you, Brandon, of how does the family as an institution impact those things? And then maybe Derek, how might that be valuable in those specific policy conversations?
Yeah, so there's a little thought experiment that I like to run through when I think about the civic importance of the family and why we might care about the family in the realm of politics. And the thought experiment goes something like this. So imagine, that we are going back to the bad old days of monarchy. Okay, so it's not, I don't want this, but so imagine that you've got a young king. Now, one thing you might ask, well, do we care what is in the mind of that king? Do we care how that king is being raised? Do we care about the education they are receiving? And I think the answer that all of us would say is, well, of course we do. We care about that because that king is going to rule us. They are going to be setting down the laws that govern all of us. And so Aristotle says that the only thing that distinguishes a good government from a bad government is two things. So number one, who who is ruling and for what purpose? Okay, are they ruling for the public good, or are they ruling for their own personal interest? Now, the genius that I argue in my book of the American founders is that they translated that logic of the importance of educating a king into the logic of a republic. They knew that every time you see a baby being rolled in a stroller out to the car, out from the hospital, those are future rulers. Because in a citizen democracy, we govern each other. So it matters a lot what they're going home to. Now, in the home, are they going to hear through word and then also see and practice the habits of Republican government? Are they going to be in a situation where they become empowered to see problems and address them as a unit, and then also be able to have those tools as an individual to do it? And so for me, so Derek was talking about, some of the economic things that are important, but when we're thinking about politics, the family is really getting at the heart of how we create people who are self-governing, people who not only are capable of doing it, but really love it and take those burdens on themselves gladly.
So with respect to, I want to dig in a little bit though to, have you seen anything in the data that show, is there a correlation between family structure, marriage and family structure with voting rates or volunteerism rates? Does anything about the family as an institution being strong bolster our other civic institutions with respect to, again, I'm thinking things like elections just because of the work you've done on it, Derek. Brandon, have you seen any kind of correlation there?
Oh,
and what
absolutely.
has that? What's the case for that?
So Raj Chetty has done some great work on this, and the simple answer to your question is that for voting participation, really all measures of civic participation, the higher the number of two-parent households that you have in a neighborhood, the higher that civic engagement is going to be. And so now connecting this to what I was just saying, I think that is because this is where so in the family, people are receiving really the touchstone of civic engagement, learning how to address these problems and to govern themselves.
So, Derek, folks who care deeply about civic engagement and voting in elections that say, well, we want to have increased voting rates and civic engagement in various ways, should they just try and get more people married, having kids? I mean, to put it kind of in a silly way, but what do you see as sort of the policy implications of, should it shift the way we talk about issues like that, I guess?
Well, I think it should lead to greater recognition of some of the factors that might be driving issues of civic engagement. Oftentimes we simply think of things like, well, are elections competitive, and how do people perceive elections being driven or policy making being driven? Say, is it by money? Is it by public good? Other things, and those are important, right? But understanding some of the underlying factors at play that. When you have a community like Brandon mentions from Raj Chetty, where it's more broken families, that has downstream impact even on our politics, even on the way that people engage in society. And frankly, from a common sense standpoint, that makes sense. If you grow up in a home with two parents and see that kind of structure and relationship versus growing up in a home. And this is not to say these are the only two things out there. There are a lot of amazing single parents, right? Maybe that's another example. Growing up in a single parent home where a parent works amazingly hard and is like your hero and for taking care of you, versus a family where maybe you don't even grow up with one of your biological parents because they've had struggles and you're in a foster care system, or any number of scenarios that play out. That's going to impact how you view society, and how you view society is then going to bleed into how you interact with and engage society. Maybe you end up in a situation where you feel you're powerless to change anything because that's been your life experience through your family scenario. Alternatively, you've been taught by your family experience, whatever structure that may be, that you have the power to change your life and to direct your life. That's going to change how you engage with society, probably more constructively. And so these factors are always at play, and oftentimes we overlook them because we don't think through the lens of families. We think through the lens of a government institution or an individual or a business or something else. And that's why here at Sutherland, one of our main goals has been to elevate the institution of the family to the same level as those other institutions I just mentioned. When we're talking about policy, we should talk about what its impact on business is. We should talk about what its impact on local and state and federal governments are. And we should talk about what its impact on families is, because people behave different in families than they do individually on their own. And oftentimes we kind of set the former aside and focus solely on the latter.
We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to expand on that thought a little bit, just this idea of the institution of the family and how, essentially what are we missing in our policy debates that could benefit from this elevation of the family as a core building block, as an inherent, essential civic institution that's critical to all these other things we talk about. And as you said, Brandon, it's kind of foundational because that's the first learning and growth environment for humans, for kids, is in typically in a family environment. So why don't I get into all of that, but we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Defending Ideas. We're talking with Brandon Dabling and Derek Monson. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn. We've been talking about marriage and family, not just in economic terms, but in institutional and civic terms. What does the institution of marriage and family mean for, yes, children, but also for America, for all the things we care about to be able to function in a healthy way in this country? We're going to talk and continue the conversation now with Brandon Dabling and dive a little deeper, Brandon, into what we talked about in the first segment along with Derek. And what I want to ask you is, there's a lot of debate and discussion about marriage and family, especially in the context of social policy and public policy in our country right now. But I want to ask you, through the institutional lens, and as you did in your book, kind of a deep dive historically of what has this institution of marriage and family meant for Americans for the duration of this country's existence, and what does it mean now? With that frame of reference that you have, what do you see being debated today in our modern discussions about marriage and family that you think miss something fundamental about the institutional significance?
Absolutely. And this is what I am passionate about. And as you mentioned, this is at the heart of what I discuss in my book. So I approach the institution of the family through looking at what some of the early Americans, and especially the founders, had to say about marriage. And probably the most important American founder that I focus on is James Wilson. Now, many of our listeners won't be familiar with him, and that is a shame because he is extremely important. He is so he was one of the few to both sign and then also be an integral part of shaping the Constitution, or sign the Declaration, and then also be able to be a part of the Constitutional Convention. And he's also the founder who, more than any other, really thought about how marriage affected a Republican government. And what he says is that when we look at a free society, basically there are two pillars of that society. One is going to be the public. It's going to be government. There are going to be some commercial spheres in there as well. But then there's going to be the social side. And if you do not have these two pillars strong, you're not going to have a free society. There's just no way. You need to have that social side that is strong, free, and that is largely organic, and that is constituted by individuals who are conducting their lives and building something. And he said that the heart of that is the family. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in the previous segment is that the family is really, it's a lab of Republican government, of self-governance. That's where people learn the habits of that. And So when we think about the importance, you have to think about what we do in this country to empower families to to solve the problems that they face. Now, so we have to have that lens of that. The family is a touchstone of all of our civic institutions.
So thinking about how that institution relates to other institutions, one of the things I'm curious about is, again, in this realm of policy debate, we often so heavily focus on things like childcare programs, pre-K, after-school programs, K-12 in general, workforce programs, welfare programs. And again, I don't want to diminish the positive impact that these kinds of programs can have. And in my own career, I've worked in close proximity and with these kinds of programs for agencies sometimes implementing these kinds of programs. So knowing that there can be a very beneficial place for those kinds of things. With that recognition, though, it seems like the conversation publicly focuses a lot on those at the expense of the family as an institution. So I guess these other programs and institutions, can they replace or adequately fill the gaps of what family does or not? And if that's the case, again, do we kind of need to reorient our public dialogue a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer to that question is no. I don't think that these other institutions can replace the indispensable role that the family plays. And there are a couple of reasons. Number one, as Derek mentioned in the previous segment, we as human beings are not simply consumer beings. We are more than the sum of our material wants. There are more things that drive us, that animate our imaginations. I'm fond of a story from Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of the great American writers, and he wrote a very playful yet profound short essay that's called Fire Worship. And the quick version of the story is that he is dealing with a time when Americans are starting to have the stove in their home. Okay, now we think about that today, and we're like, the stove? Oh, yeah, it's whatever. It's been around forever. But he was looking at it and says, this is going to transform family life. And his basic thought process was that with an open fire, the only way to stay warm was for the family to gather around it. And the magic of the fire was that it brought the family into one common space where they talked to each other, shared stories, and in short, shared a life and built a life together. And what happened with the stove, and again, he's being playful, is that it blows air that's perfectly hot into every corner of the house. So all of a sudden, the kids can go off in their corner of the house, the parents can go off in theirs, and, they don't have to talk to each other. We can see parallels to the internet, okay? And so he gives a little thought experiment where he says that, he says, I'm kind of worried about this. And he imagines what would happen if we, as a country, happen to be invaded. And he says, what would be our rallying cry? Would we say fight for our stoves? It used to be that we said fight for our hearths, fight for family and hearth. And there's a reason historically why those had been tied together. It's because the hearth was where the family gathered. And without that, he worries, what's going to happen? Now, just to make a connection that Hawthorne makes, he says, in most people's mind, when the things that really motivate them as individuals are the things that are relational, the things that they find as being beautiful, the love that exists between a husband and a wife, between parents and their children, between neighbors. When most people, are summoned to the battlefield, that's what they have in mind. Is these are my loves. It's not, making $500 extra a year, cheaper coffee. It's these relationships, these things that are tangible, that they can lay grasp on and that they experience every day. These are the things that they find beautiful and are motivating and that really drive their imagination. Now, Hawthorne gives the extreme example of fighting, but going back to what Derek was mentioning earlier, these are also the things that motivate us to get involved in politics. Okay, when parents go to a board meeting, it's because they have taken ownership over their lives and of their family. They want the best for their kids. Okay, that is not strictly a materialistic concern. And again, I just want to say I'm not belittling that, but this is on another level. They want the best for their kids, and they want their kids to be taught the best principles and to have the best future. And so that's what's motivating them to get into politics. So when we think about civic engagement, you have to tie it to these things that are really driving us as individuals. And I think at the root of all of this is it's nothing abstract, hypothetical. It's the relationships and the goods that they experience on a day-to-day basis.
I want to ask you this. So talking about family and marriage as being something that motivates whether somebody gets engaged on an issue. And one thing I want to mention too is when we talk about how the kind of the fundamental purpose of the family, both in the formative development of kids and how you mentioned earlier that it can't really adequately be replaced by other programs and institutions. As a comment on that, obviously there are, like we said, there are benefits of these other programs and institutions, especially for people who don't grow up in, again, what we might think of as sort of the ideal family setting with married couple households raising kids. And so one of the things that I think is very compelling, I think this ties into this idea of what motivates me in my life, is one of our previous guests on this podcast is Ian Rowe, who's a senior fellow at AEI. He runs schools in New York. He's written a book called Agency, and he just has a phenomenally compelling vision about education and faith and work and also family and how this sort of creates the ingredients for a person to have sort of free will guided by moral discernment, which is his definition of agency. But one of the things he mentions is it's not about the family that you're from, but the family that you form. And I think the recognition of that is, especially as a message for young people, you may come from a background that was challenging or difficult, but the decisions you make now and the kind of family you form, that can kind of be the center of what motivates you in your education, in your work, in your civic engagement. And so I want to ask you, because it seems to me that it's more than just, well, if you're married with kids, you will be motivated to get involved. There are plenty of people who get involved who are not married with kids. But yes, it motivates you, but have you seen anything in your research or in the data, does it impact how people get involved or maybe why they get involved? Are there some different layers that there's just something powerful about, I'm getting involved civically, but also it's because I have my wife and kids at home and I care deeply about them and I want to make a better world for them. Is there something unique and powerful about that kind of motivation for civic engagement?
Yeah, I think so. I think that one thing that comes to mind is that it broadens your vision of the community. And one of the things that is interesting about family life is that husbands, wives, spouses, they choose each other, but they don't choose their kids, as far as I know. They can choose to have children, but I have siblings who have children, and these children have interests that are so different than their own. But what happens, all of a sudden, my brother, who is diehard softball, when he was growing up single, he would play softball 4 days a week, but now he's taking his daughter to ballet, to dancing. And that engages him with a part of a community that he otherwise wouldn't be engaged in. Okay, similarly, so the accidental quality of family life puts you in a situation where you engage with people that you probably wouldn't otherwise engage with. And it turns out that in a free society, that's a beautiful thing, because it also turns out that I didn't choose my neighbors. I didn't choose directly everyone in the community, but I have to find a way to build a life with them. And so I think that element is important. Now, the other thing is that the ownership that exists within, as you were mentioning, within your own family that you are forming, is that it is very much going to be geared towards leaving the world a better place for your kids. You are viewing the future because it is tied directly to, again, nothing abstract, but okay, what is life going to be like for my little girl, for my son? When I go to a school board meeting, I'm not thinking about things in the abstract. I'm thinking about, okay, what is going to be taught to my kid? The amount of ownership is going to increase quite naturally.
That I've mentioned this previously, but an experience that I had that I think helps encapsulate that. A couple years back, a work colleague of mine at the time, we were having a work discussion and brainstorming some future projects. So he asked me, he's like, so Nic, when you think of 10 years from now, what do you think of? And I knew, he's fishing for a policy answer, right? Because we work in public policy. And, Utah's economy is going to look like this, or, the country is going to look like this, and we need to prepare for it, whatever it was. But I had recently learned that my wife and I were going to have a baby. We were pregnant. And so now instantly, my frame of reference was, without even thinking about it, just instinctively, 10 years from now, hang on, I'm going to have a 10-year-old son. Instantly, everything changed. Now, and I've been working in policy for a number of years before I got married and had kids, and it hasn't changed the fact that I have cared about these issues deeply, but it adds a layer that's a little different to where now I think, okay, my family, my kids, 10 years from now or beyond, what are we doing as a state, as a country, to create something that's going to be a place where they can live the American dream? And so it really, I think you're tapping into something that's probably fundamental for a lot of people, whether or not they consciously think of it as, my frame of reference is different now.
And I think that the fact that it is so intuitive, maybe a part of the reason why sometimes these discussions about the family go by the wayside when we talk about politics. We get it at an intuitive level, but going back to Ian Rose, one of the things that he talks about is this idea of being an entrepreneur, and not just meaning that in the sense of starting a company, but taking ownership of your life, knowing that what you do is going to make a difference. And I think that this is exactly what you're talking about too, is that knowing that what you're doing right now is going to affect your 10-year-old. And that is a beautiful thing for a community as a whole to recognize.
The other thing I wanted to pinpoint, when you're talking about how being in the institution of marriage and family, it sort of forces you to interact with people from other communities that you may not inherently interact with. I mean, as you think of somebody who, like a young single working professional, vibrant, great life, lots of community and friends. But then if you have kids and, marriage and kids, it just sort of, again, forces you to have interactions that maybe you didn't have before. And I think that ties into something, one of the other leaders that we know well here and we are a fan of is Yuval Levin and his work on institutions, which, again, we're talking about the institution of marriage and family. And to me, I want to see if we can expand it in the minute or two before we have to take another break, but into this idea of the institutions themselves that we're talking about. Not only are they inherently beneficial to that institution and to the people in it, but they can sort of accidentally strengthen other institutions, because if I'm engaging with my family in a certain way, and that's putting me in different proximities, whether it's my church, whether it's the local park, whatever these, you mentioned sporting events for kids, if it sort of forces us kind of to be involved in these other institutions, that strengthens those institutions. And that seems to be one of the things that's eroded so much. Many great thinkers have written about this recently, that those intermediary institutions that bond neighbors together and community members together that are bigger than just your family, but smaller than your national political party. We need those, and this seems to be a good way to help to bolster and strengthen those.
Absolutely, I agree, and it really gets at the heart of some fundamental questions. And to frame it in a philosophical way, I would say that the dirty little secret about life in even in our modern age of, where we think that, everything is about choice, what we realize is that there are some things that are going to be accidental, but that can be a really good thing. And now you were talking about how family can force you into some different situations. But so the family is the first place where people learn how to do that. Okay, I think that it's a story as old as time, it's sibling rivalry. Siblings who don't get along, and yet they have to figure out how to make it work. Even if all they can figure out is just not to punch each other. Okay, if they can figure out that, okay, that's a win. Okay, and it turns out that this is going to have enormous ramifications later on, because when we get into the political arena, we're going to have to be in a room with people that maybe we don't like, and hopefully we can do more than not punch them.
There's something really important that I want to jump on real quick, is that it's that exact thing, is that there's such a narrative around this idea of a national divorce, a political divorce. We all see the polarization and how frustrating it can feel. But the sibling relationship, when you're 10, you can't just choose to leave and say, well, that's not my brother anymore. They are your brother. You've got to figure it out.
Yeah,
as a country,
this is a democracy. I'm out.
Right. As a country, I think there honestly is such a viewpoint of, well, the other side just needs to go away. And that's just not realistic. Like, you're going to wake up tomorrow, they're still going to be there. Yes, we have fundamental disagreements and we need to debate and discuss, but we also need to figure out how to live together.
Absolutely. And so this is one of the things that family teaches people from the very beginning. So I don't know what your childhood was like, but for me, and this may date me somewhat, but my mother during the summer I would do my chores, and then she'd kick me out. And I would go off and climb trees, build forts, get into fights, play basketball, and have fun. Now, at the time, I just thought I was having fun. But when I look back through my nerdy philosophical lens, what I realized is that I was learning life skills. I was learning how to govern myself. I was learning how to, not that I was a dictator on the playground, but I was learning how to govern among a group of equals, peers. So when we decide what sport we're going to play, we have to decide that together. When someone gets angry, we have to figure out how to smooth over those differences. These are all beautiful things that children learn in this play, that siblings learn without resorting to a third-party authority. And these also happen to be the core skills of freedom that we require in our civic society.
Brandon, is there anything you see as far as, okay, what's next? Recognizing this history we've come through as a country with respect to the institution of marriage and family and how impactful it is on all these things we're talking about. Looking forward, and especially even just looking at the environment that we're in today, with political debates and elections and all these different things, what should we learn from our nation's history that can be a positive, helpful principle as we look at what we should do moving forward with respect to the institution of marriage and family and how that can help strengthen the other things that we care about?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful question. There's a quote that I like that comes from Alexander Hamilton, and this is part of the Federalist Papers. And here he frames the purpose of America in perhaps the broadest and most foundational sense possible. And this is what he says. He says, "It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they will be forever destined to depend on their political constitutions on accident and force. Okay, so to summarize that, what he's saying is that it's up to us right now as Americans to settle the question of whether human beings are really capable of governing themselves, or if they are just meant to be at the whims of some outside authority. Now, we look at that today, and I think maybe we're a little too blasé when we say that, well, of course, we're all equal. Of course we can govern ourselves. But what Hamilton would say is like, I want us to govern ourselves well. I want rights to be protected, and I want us to govern ourselves according to the best deliberation and according to the public good. And I think that while all of us might disagree about the exact details of what that would look like, I think we would agree on that. And so when we look at the family, the one thing that we can never forget is that just as we would care about what's in the head of a king, we need to care about what's in the heart and what's in the minds of his fellow citizens. Now, I'm certainly not advocating for any heavy-handed program. I think that would be antithetical to the goods of free and liberal government. But we do very much need to care about fostering those goods of self-government. And the best way to do that is within the family, where you can teach those principles. So just to wrap it up, I think that when we think about all policies, as Derek was mentioning, we need to think about how they affect the family, because it is in the family where those goods of self-government are going to be fostered more than anywhere else.
Well, Brandon, I think that's a very hopeful note to end our discussion on. One of the things that, as our regular listeners know, sometimes I have to kind of poke and prod our guests to say, okay, how do we end on an optimistic note? Give us some hope that these tough issues are things that we can really grapple with in a positive way. So to me, what one of the key takeaways of what you're saying is this idea that it's up to us, and the founders intended it that way, is that the self-government will not happen on its own accord. It's up to each of us to invest in ourselves, invest in our kids, with the notion that self-government takes effort, and that doesn't just pass on naturally. There's that very famous quote from Ronald Reagan that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction, where he says that it doesn't get passed on in the bloodstream. Essentially saying we have to work at it. And the family is perhaps one of the most important areas that too often gets left aside in these public discussions of where we actually can continue to foster this ideal of freedom. So I want to thank you for your book. Thank you for the research you've done on this issue, and for coming on this show to lend your time and expertise about the importance of the institution of marriage and family and the rich legacy that it has in this country. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Well, we have one more quick break before we finish off our conversation. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I think the big takeaway from this conversation is to remind ourselves that having healthy, intact families positively impacts our communities, our state, and our nation in a variety of different ways. In many respects, the family is the most fundamental institution of civil society, so it ought to be elevated in the many debates we have about different public policy issues. We want to thank you for joining us on this episode, and special thanks to Derek and Brandon for sharing their time and expertise. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please visit defendingideas.org. From there, you can get access to short clips from this and previous episodes that we encourage you to share on social media and use in your discussions about these issues with friends and family. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, any of the major platforms wherever you like to get your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button. Lastly, if you want to support our work, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.